Hello, everyone. Welcome to the NCADP webinar. So happy that everyone can join us. I know some of you guys are already using the chat room. I am Kristen Whitney Daniels. I'll be moderating the panel today. And please feel free to use the chat room. I'll be looking over there periodically as we go through introducing everyone, introducing the topic, and we will take questions periodically and have additional time at the end. So please feel free to keep using that chat function over there. And so just a little bit of information about this particular webinar. The NCADP launched the webinar, Justice Powered by Information, to provide participants the opportunity to hear from experts and activists working on a wide range of social justice issues and make the connection to ending capital punishment. Today, you'll be hearing about Pope Francis's revisions on the death penalty in the Roman Catholic Catechism from scholars and activists Francis Schussler Fiorenza and Krisanne Vaillancourt Murphy. And like I said, if anyone is just joining us, please feel free to throw any questions in the chat room, and we will take them as soon as we can. And so we'll introduce the panelists a little bit first before we get into the deep part of Francis's comments. First up, we have Francis Schussler Fiorenza. He's a Stillman Professor of Roman Catholic Theological Studies at Harvard Divinity School. He previously taught at Notre Dame, Villanova, and the Catholic University of America. And his primary interests are the fields of fundamental or foundational theology. And then we have Krisanne Vaillancourt Murphy, who is the Executive Director of Catholic Mobilizing Network, a national organization dedicated to valuing life over death. And that includes advocating against the death penalty and pushing for restorative justice practices. And Catholic Mobilizing Network also sponsors the National Catholic Pledge to End the Death Penalty, the Mercy in Action program. And I'm sure Krisanne will talk a little bit more about those programs later and some of the other programs that are going on within the organization. And like I said, I'm Kristen Whitney Daniels, and I am the Assistant Executive Director of the U.S. Federation of the Sisters of St. Joseph. And I have also worked as the Bertelsen editorial intern at the National Catholic Reporter, where I started my beat as a death penalty reporter. And I still continue that beat today as a freelance reporter for the organization. So to get started, we want to clarify a little bit and set the stage with Pope Francis's comment and the statement itself, because there's a little confusion around it. So first of all, the Catechism, which is the book of Catholic doctrine for Catholics. Pope Francis made a revision, and there's a lot of word choice around there, but the way that he puts it is a clarification of what previous popes have already stated about the death penalty. And he went on to make the death penalty inadmissible in all cases. It was previously, there's a little caveat for situations that where the public, it was necessary to protect the public. And Pope John Paul II said that that was very rare, if not practically non-existent. So to get us all started, Krisanne and Francis, if it was just a revision, a clarification, what is the big deal about Pope Francis's comment, and what does this mean for the anti-death penalty movement?
Well, I'll start, and then I'd love to hear from Francis. So I'll just say that we very much welcome and celebrate this revision, this codification of the inadmissibility of the death penalty. It's in some ways not surprising because for the last 20 plus years, Pope John Paul II, Pope Benedict, and now Pope Francis they've all been very much moving clearly in this direction, where the death penalty should be very rare, where it's considered unnecessary, contrary to the gospel, a stain on human dignity. So many very profound and strong words from these holy fathers for the last number of decades. What's unique here is that on August 2nd of just last month, 2018, Pope Francis took one further step, and he actually very clearly resolves any ambiguity about the death penalty, saying that it's inadmissible because it's an attack on the inviolability of the dignity of the human person. And he says that the church seeks with determination abolition for an end to the death penalty. So, as if there were any questions from the last 20 plus years, this makes it just crystal clear and puts it into our guidebook, into the summary of our Catholic teaching, which is the Catechism, this very teaching itself, where there's been a situation where it's been called very rare, or as you said, Kristen, just in need for protecting in situations where society needs to be protected. Unfortunately, many people would think that they understood that nuance, and then as faithful Catholics feel like they were okay in supporting the death penalty. Pope Francis now clarifies that, takes away any ambiguity. So that is what's new here. That's what's exciting for the abolition movement.
And Francis, if you could answer that question. And also, we have a question from Roland Lawrence about why do you think the Pope has made this statement, maybe particularly now of all times?
Well, first of all, let me just say, I agree with everything that she just has said. So, I mean, there's not one word of what she said that I would disagree with. I might add is that maybe the change in attitude toward the death penalty goes back even further. I mean, if you look, for example, at Europe, in the use of the fact that governments, the Nazi governments were using the death penalty to kill off political opponents, etc. Practically every single European country since World War II built it into their constitution that the death penalty was invalid. So we're living in a world where many countries, the European Union itself, outlaws the death penalty constitutionally. That puts Europe in a completely different situation than we are. If you look, for example, at Pope Francis coming from Argentina, where under a previous government there was an extreme use of the death penalty for political motives, that made him also, from his own context, much more sensitive. So that's one point I would like to add. The other point I would like to add is that actually when John Paul II came out with his statements, there was a lot of opposition and criticism of John Paul II. So it isn't that the criticism of Francis is new, but he was criticized for that. And some person said, well, it's not in the Catholic Catechism. And John Paul then said, well, I'll take care of that. And he immediately brought in the stricter in view of criticisms of us to make sure that it was in the Catholic Catechism. Now, I would say, I mean, I think a lot is behind this. But we often think of the Catholic Church as if nothing changes. But you have to think, you know, when someone asked Cardinal Newman, is slavery okay? He said, well, I'm against slavery, but you can't say it's intrinsically evil. John Paul II went to Malta, which was the center for where slaves gathered from Africa were shipped to the United States or to the Western Hemisphere. And he said, slavery is intrinsically evil. Now, I think there are a couple of changes. One, what is the gospel really about? Is retribution really a part of what the gospel message is? So in other words, if you're a Christian and understanding Christian values, should rehabilitation rather than retribution be your primary understanding or approach to prisons and to punishment for crimes that are committed? So I think that's one part. Another shift that I think is really important, and it doesn't come up in conversation, is the notion of sovereignty. You have to realize that, you know, in the Middle Ages, you thought, the phrase was used, the king has two bodies. One is his own and the other is the state or the political body. And he rules by divine right. You go back to the Hebrew Bible, and King David is looked upon as a divinely endowed sovereign. But sovereignty has changed. We no longer have a divine right kings, but sovereignty is dependent upon votes by popular people. So you can't claim the state has the same divine right immediacy that one did in previous generations. You have to realize a lot of laws are political. A lot of laws are ad hoc compromises, etc. And so this changes the whole relationship between claiming that the state is acting in the name of God. We realize how much the state acts in terms of popular opinion, etc. And that puts into some question appeals to the sovereignty of the state and its right to kill people.
Speaking of popular opinion, not everybody was as excited as some of the activists about this clarification from the Pope. Now we view it as a clarification, a revision, but why do you think there's still such an outcry from some portions of the Catholic people?
I don't know. I mean, I feel that sometimes, whenever you get a horrendous crime, that's really terrible, and someone has done horrible things in terms of killing people, etc. I think there's almost an instinctive, because you're appalled by it, feel you have to sort of punish the person, etc. And so I think that's a sort of a natural instinct. But the question is, are there better parts of our nature that we can appeal to, in which we would have to say no? I mean, I understand this instinct. I understand this attitude. Can we appeal to a better and to a more gospel-oriented sense of what we should be doing?
Mm-hmm.
I would just add that I do think that we have a lot of work to do as a society about what it means to build a culture of life. Mm-hmm. And so the Catholic Church believes, certainly when there has been a grave crime, that there should be justice, but there also should be mercy. So the death penalty falls in the span of life issues, because we're really talking about snuffing out someone's life, taking out the possibility for redemption by execution. And so what that means is we need to start really strengthening how we believe in what is pro-life, what is the valuing of all life. And when we look at the sacred value of all life, that has been, in some Catholic circles, determined that we're really talking about the unborn. But when we talk about it at Catholic Mobilizing Network, we're talking about the whole span of life issues for the church. So the death penalty has been a bit of a stepchild in that all life or pro-life conversation within our church, as just a critique of my own tradition. But I think that really kind of rubs people the wrong way, in addition to what Francis said about, there are grave harm and grave crimes, and it definitely brings up our hackles, and we want justice to be served, and we need to rely more on that merciful gospel orientation and posture, and seek mercy as well, and consider the value of all life from womb to tomb.
Right. I agree with everything you say. I would like to maybe add something and point to another perspective of our society. We live in a very racially divisive society. And so you see how often there are more African Americans, for example, who are arrested and get longer prison terms than, let's say, white persons do. A teenager does something wrong, and a white person, local police may bring him to his family, or the judge may give him just some community service to do, where this often involves lengthy processes. We're also finding among death penalties that it's much more racially determined, that African Americans are more likely getting the death penalty. And then we're finding out there are surveys showing that DNA evidence to show that people who were executed by the death penalty turned out to have been innocent on the basis of DNA evidence. And this is, every once in a while you read about someone being released from prison, having been there for 20 years, and DNA evidence has cleared them. Now, if the death penalty were more easily executed, they might have been executed, and there'd be no way to undo the evilness that's present in our society. So we have to be aware that we as a society are very fallible. We as a society have our own prejudices. So I think there's two aspects. You got to appeal to what the gospel is really about, which you emphasized in your response, but you also have to look at what are the prejudices and what are the weaknesses of our own society that we have to seek to correct.
Good point.
So right before Pope Francis's comments in August, Pew Research came out with, every year they do the research on who still believes in the death penalty, and they break it down by religion. 73% of white evangelical Protestants, 61% of white mainline Protestants, and 53% of Catholics still support the death penalty. The USCCB has publicly stated their stance, which is the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. They're kind of the law-abiding group for the U.S. on these sorts of issues. And still, more than half of Catholics still support the death penalty. Do you think this revision, clarification by the Pope will lead to a shift of views by people in the pews, not just, clergy and above?
I think it could over time. You have to think it became a part of the catechism only within the last 15 years or 20 years. I remember, I don't know, a part of it's a part of religious education. Now, I ended up going to public schools until high school, and all I got was First Communion or release time in New York City. But I don't remember even the death penalty being ever raised in a sermon or being raised as a part of religious education. So that I think we have to look upon the church. Our sermons emphasizing sexuality more than they're emphasizing other aspects of church teaching, and therefore this has led to a kind of a one-sided or a lack of a full awareness of what Catholic teaching is. So it's my hope that over time, when the Catholic Catechism is taught more vigorously, that may lead to a change in attitude among Catholics. So I mean, it's a hope that one can have, and I think when someone raised it, a bishop raised it with the Pope, well, it's not in the Catechism, and the Pope said, well, we got to immediately do that, and he immediately made that change.
I would agree. I think that it will be over time. So I think the time question is where we have work to do. There's important formation that needs to happen at the parish level, in Catholic schools, in all catechesis going on in the church for the rites of Christian initiation for adults and beyond. Really, what is the teaching? But I think we need to give people in the pews human stories of those perhaps victims' families who are also opposing the death penalty, vigorously saying, please don't kill someone else that's a dishonoring to my loved one that was lost. I think we need to have the catechism clarified, which now this has been done. And then I think our efforts at the pew, in the pews and among Catholic catechists is to give them a story to hang on to so that it reaches their heart and that we can grow into this change. Catholic Mobilizing initiated 1 month after the revision its Hope Over Death campaign, which is to do just this. Yeah. We have a video, we have the National Catholic Pledge to End the Death Penalty, Kristen, which you mentioned. We have all sorts of resources that help everyday Catholics, in addition to bishops and priests and women religious all over the country, educate about this and proclaim this new teaching.
We have a comment from John Shively, and I think part of the problem is many of these people who commit violent crimes come from very dark backgrounds. How do we get other Catholics to care about the fact that many of these people themselves were victims of abuse, drug use, and surrounded by a culture of death? So I think, Krisanne, you talked about that a little bit. Can you talk a little bit how organizations are addressing the death penalty and having it be a part of this fuller picture of what pro-life issues look like?
I would say that I just wanted to remind us that this very week we have 2 executions scheduled in Texas. One is Troy Clark, who has very much this background that John has just mentioned, terribly traumatic, was born with fetal alcohol syndrome. Mother was engaged in prostitution because they were in poverty. I mean, there was just, from his birth, there were just so many issues of trauma that he experienced. And so that is the kind of information that's not allowed in the courtroom. Daniel Acker is also scheduled for execution this week, again in Texas. So the more that we know about these stories of people's lives and the trauma they have experienced, the more we know that death penalty is not a deterrent for future crime, that it does suffer from these injustices around, discriminating disproportionately people of color. The more that we know all those things, the more that I think we really truly understand the collateral damage of the death penalty.
Great. Francis, do you have anything you wanted to add to that?
I think she answers it well. I have nothing really to add. I think all the points that she raises are really important in terms of there's a lot of education and understanding that has to take place. And that's really what's important.
I want to talk a little bit about the political sphere that this could have an impact on. There are many governors and senators with a Catholic background, in addition to a U.S. Supreme Court with currently four Catholics on it. Do you see this clarification playing a role in future political decisions about the death penalty and also in impacting juries? I saw a comment by Sister Helen Prejean about this now becoming a religious freedom moment for people who are selected for juries in death penalty cases.
I would say in terms of the Supreme Court, because you mentioned the highest court in the land, certainly there have been Catholics, there have been moderates, there have been conservative Catholics on the Supreme Court. And this hasn't necessarily affected decisions, but truthfully, up to this point, the Supreme Court has not decided upon the standards of decency around the death penalty. The court cases that they have been offered have mostly been where they have to specifically address the case itself, not the morality of the death penalty. If and when that happens, I think the fact that there are Catholics there, or that the Catholic Church has made its teaching ever more clear, I think that will have an impact. Where I think we can really make a difference is with Catholic legislators at the state level. We just saw a very close but no cigar vote in New Hampshire around the death penalty. The House, the Senate of the state legislature approved the repeal of the death penalty, and the only last New England state to have it. Unfortunately, its Catholic governor vetoed or overrode that. He vetoed that bill. So in cases where there's governors, we can target them. We can try to lift up those values that they proclaim. But state legislatures, we're seeing that both conservatives and Republicans, or Republicans and Democrats, conservative liberals, are coming up against the death penalty and saying that it's no longer an option or should no longer be in those states. So we can pressure at the state level. That's definitely an option at this point.
Yeah, I think that's the point. I think a lot of politicians operate, sadly to say, on how will something affect their being electable. And it's only when you get a mass education where people have sensitized to this issue that will change really take place, where you can't have a governor thinking, well, will people say I'm soft on crime and therefore I may not get reelected? And you have to try to work through that on a more popular level basis, and hope that it changes. I'm lucky that I'm in Massachusetts, so that I feel that at least it's a progressive state in that regard. But I realize a lot of states are in that situation.
And do you agree with Sister Helen's comments about this eventually coming out further about this being a religious freedom issue on juries?
I'm not quite sure what it meant. In other words, maybe if I were, let's say, selected for a jury, which could involve the death penalty, I don't know. I would perhaps want to sit on the jury, maybe to express my opposition to the death penalty. When depending on to what extent the jury decides how to evaluate this case,
right?
If you could have a voice in that, etc. So that would be the question. So I would have to know more about exactly what the context. The work she has done in regard to the death penalty has been enormous, and with prisons, and so I have the highest regard for her, and we've invited her to talk to Harvard Divinity School a few times because we're so convinced of the value of her work. So she is sort of one of the heroes of Harvard because of her work.
I think for a little more clarification, her point is that for a lot of death penalty juries, they often ask people about their religious background and their beliefs in the death penalty. And for more and more people, they're excluding them based on their beliefs from these juries.
Right.
So I think that's where her comments are going.
You can't ask that question of a person.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Krisanne, you can go.
I'll leave it at that.
We have a question from Roland about, has the state of California used the death penalty since Arnold G. used it to terminate Tookie Williams?
California hasn't executed anyone in more than 10 years. What's very troubling now is that California had a very confusing ballot referendum, which was lost, which was kept the death penalty alive there. It has the largest death row in the country, which really means likely the largest death row in the world at San Quentin. There are 20 people on the row that have exhausted their appeals process. So when California resumes executions, probably wouldn't happen this year, but potentially next year if we can't change it otherwise, those first 20 would be the first to go. So although I've talked to Californians who kind of forget to some degree that they have the death penalty because people are in San Quentin and they're just kind of languishing, but there's been no executions to call attention to the fact that 750 people are sitting on the row. So that's where it stands in that state.
We're getting kind of close to the end of this webinar. So if anybody else has any lingering questions, please feel free to type them in now. And I'll just ask for a few last comments from both Krisanne and Frances, whatever else they would like to add to this.
Well, I just want to reiterate that I think if there's Catholics that are listening in to the webinar, or people of goodwill who want to look at the faith perspective of this issue and the valuing of all life, I would invite them to catholicsmobilizing.org. We have many resources. We have videos. We have other fact sheets. Every state has information on what the death penalty situation is there, if it's been repealed, if there's been a current repeal, what the local organizations are about, what they're doing on the ground. We have just lots of information. So catholicsmobilizing.org. And we just relaunched our National Catholic Pledge to End the Death Penalty, which is a reiteration now of the inadmissibility of the death penalty. So we would urge folks to sign on to that, committing to educate, advocate, and pray, to do some of that work of formation, making sure that people understand all aspects of the death penalty and that we can end it in this country.
Yeah, I would like to one point I would like to add is the popular press gives it may leave the impression that what Pope Francis did was a radical departure from previous popes. And if you look, I mean, and because he's sometimes presented as a liberal, you have to look that actually John Paul II, as well as Ratzinger, said it. So what he is saying fits into a tradition of the three previous popes and their teaching. So it's not so much, I would say, rather than look upon him as an innovator, I would look upon him as drawing out the consequences of a tradition that now has been going on for 20 years in the Catholic Church.
Well, I don't see any more questions. So thank you so much, Krisanne and Frances, for being a part of this panel. If anybody has any lingering questions that come up, please feel free to email the NCADP. I think I can speak for all of us and say that we're all open to more questions and willing to answer them and get the answers back to you and out there.
Okay.
So thank you, everyone.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for listening.
Okay,
Thanks,
bye.
everyone.
Bye now.
Bye.